So, welcome. Thank you for joining us for tonight's talk entitled Flexible Focus: How to Tailor Mindfulness Training for Cultures, Contexts, and Health Conditions. So, my name is Frances Baldwin Sadi, and I'm the Associate Director of Non-Degree Programs here at Brown University School of Professional Studies. So, our mission is to create and deliver programs that empower adult learners, such as yourselves, at all career stages to transform yourselves, your workplace, and the communities that you serve. So, here at Brown, we offer a portfolio of online and hybrid programs, including master's degrees, certificate programs, short courses, and masterclass webinars, such as tonight's conversation with the esteemed professor, Dr. Eric Loucks. At the end of the talk, we'll spend a brief moment highlighting some of the unique mindfulness programs that we offer, and we'll also spend some time engaging with questions from the audience. So please feel free to send us your questions throughout the talk using the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your screen. So now I have the distinct honor and privilege of introducing my friend and colleague, Dr. Eric Loucks. Eric is the founder of the Director of the Mindfulness and Director of the Mindfulness Center here at Brown University, which is one of the premier research and education-focused mindfulness centers in the world. He is a professor, researcher, speaker, author, and pioneer in the study of mindfulness and health. A recipient of multiple grants from the National Institutes of Health, Eric is the lead developer of a number of adapted mindfulness-based programming, including Mindfulness-based College for Young Adults, as well as the Mindfulness-based Blood Pressure Reduction, or MBBP, program. Over the course of his career, Eric has held teaching positions at Harvard, McGill, and Brown universities. But beyond his impressive CV, I'm particularly struck by how Eric embodies his mindfulness practice and how he allows it to ground him in the decisions that he makes. Eric, it's an honor to have you here with us tonight, and thank you for making time to speak with us about such an important topic.
Sure. Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for the introduction, Fran, and really nice to connect with you all tonight. And so, this program tonight is on, really how to adapt mindfulness programs to different cultures and contexts and health conditions. And I have experience, in those different areas, whether it's different health conditions like, say, hypertension or uh, different cultures. I've been working with Jeff Prue and some Native American communities, as well as developing a mindfulness teacher training program for people who serve historically underrepresented racial and ethnic groups in the mindfulness field. So we've been doing quite a bit of work around that, as well as working with young adults in different contexts like digital delivery or in-person delivery or delivery in college settings, for example. So those are some of the examples. And so with my colleagues, we developed a framework to better help us and help hopefully anyone who is interested in bringing mindfulness training in really respectful, effective ways to different populations and contexts to really help them do that well. And that I'll be offering this framework tonight with humbleness, knowing that it's just the current version that, there's ways for it to improve, I'm sure. And I'm always happy to hear suggestions around that regard. But it's just offered as somewhat of a gift, I suppose, if you'd like to receive it, in terms of just a framework to help you really serve the communities that you are most passionate about as effectively as possible. So we're going to take a moment just to get a sense for us. We've got 150 people here, so let's get a sense of who we are. And so we have one question around that that Fran is about to
Yes,
launch
so
as a
I'm
poll. So you'd be welcome to just respond to the poll as it pops up, and then we'll see where everybody's at.
okay.
So you can check all that apply. It might be multiple ones of these. MBSR stands for mindfulness-based stress reduction. MBCT stands for mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. But let's just get a sense of who's here. And if these roles don't represent you, you're welcome to even just chat it into the chat box, and can even read off some of those too, because we don't all fit in these categories.
Great. Great. Yes, we have some clinicians and therapists. And we'll just give a few more minutes.
Mm,
Okay, so I'm going to end the poll.
okay, good. And
So
then, Brianna, where you're seeing those? Oh, I guess it's in the chat box. I gotcha.
yeah. So great. So yeah, we have a nice broad representation. So we have about just over a quarter of individuals are MBSR instructors, or and other, including MBCT instructors and other mindfulness-based instructors, is about 35%. We've got quite a few teachers in training, so welcome. It's about 30%. We have 17% are researchers, and quite a few community members hoping to bring mindfulness programs to their communities. So welcome.
Mm. And then also seeing folks, MDs, therapists,
Mhm.
yoga teachers, someone who's working with Jeff Prue to indigenize mindfulness. Who's this? John. Welcome, John. And we even have a program officer from the National Center for Complementary Integrative Health. Jenny, welcome.
That's
We were
great.
communicating earlier today. Longtime meditator. So great. Welcome, everyone. Whatever your background is, you really are welcome here. And so the next question that I would like to offer is to just even consider, and you're welcome to put this in the chat box. Fran, do you have this posted, or should I just pop it in the chat box?
Yeah, if you want to add it to the chat box,
Okay,
and um,
so I will do that now. So the question is this like what drew you here, and what are you hoping to get out of the workshop?
and the feel free to chat this to everyone so we can get a sense of what kind of
Yes.
projects and ideas folks have.
Yeah, we've opened up the chat box so everyone can see everyone's responses now. So you're welcome to just share what drew you here and what are you hoping to get out of the workshop. And it's helpful to me actually because I'll be adapting my talk based on what I see here. So it's helping me get a sense of like who's in the room because this talk can go multiple different directions. So we can see someone's hoping to help their patients uh, with anxiety and depression. Someone's hoping to strengthen their teaching skills, see how to best adapt to older adults.
And I see a few people have hands raised. So if you have any specific questions, feel free to use that Q&A box at the bottom and we can get back to you. Mhm.
The responses, thank you.
Mhm.
As we call this like a chat waterfall. So it's so I'm just scrolling through it, inviting you all to scroll through it so we can see who's here and what we're looking to get out of the
Oh, yeah,
program.
wonderful group.
Interested in diversity of groups and strategies that might be most effective. Curious about high blood pressure and mindfulness to take blood pressure medication.
Mm.
And folks are just here to learn all they can as a student. Great. All right.
Mhm.
See some Brown alums. 57 messages. Goodness, thank you. Even Fran, if there's a way to save this,
Yeah, definitely.
it helps us better know. We're considering doing like a bigger offering in this, so it helps us see who is interested. Okay. Um, so we're going to record. We'll save these too. So I'm actually going to look at it later too. So thank you for sharing what you did. So I'm now gonna. Uh, wow, we even have someone from Nigeria. Welcome. So I'm gonna share my screen and do like a bit of like an overview to like set the tone a bit, or not even set the tone, but just like give you an overview of the framework and some examples of how it's been adapted, and then we'll shift into like more questions and answers discussion. Uh, so I'm just gonna deal with the technology for a moment. Uh, Okay, so yeah, so we're trying to just offer some frameworks on how to tailor mindfulness training for different cultures, contexts, and health conditions. And so I'll be drawing off of two particular sources. One is this field book for mindfulness innovators. You can see the citation on the bottom right. This is a free resource that you can just download off the web if you just Google that. It's from the Mindfulness Initiative. That's a really excellent organization in the United Kingdom. And Menga Sangvi and her colleagues developed this field book that is really interesting. She's like a design thinker, so she has a very creative way at addressing like mindfulness questions. And so she talks about how like, a problem well stated is a problem half solved. So I even invite you right now to really consider if, in your heart of hearts, like what do you most hope to do to serve other populations? Or what problem are you trying to solve? And you can see, the first five bullet points have the word problem in it. And we might not have a problem. We might actually be focused on flourishing, So whatever it is, but these are just like examples to help us like really drill into why we're here and what we hope for. And it may be in doing so that this program will be even more effective for you if you've got like a question really present for you. So these questions of like, what makes this problem important to you? What evidence do you have that this really is a problem? Uh, and who is this a problem for? Is it particular demographic groups? Is it people in certain regions of the world, different age groups? In what context is this a problem? And even what kind of assumptions are we making at this stage? We all have assumptions, and what are ours, perhaps? And even what change or impact would you like to create? So these are just invitations to self-reflect on really what we're hoping to do to serve the communities that we care about and to really drill into it to help us then craft something. If we understand the problem really well, we can often craft a better solution. And so I'd even invite you now to, just come up with a specific problem that matters to you that you wonder if it could be solved by mindfulness, and even actually just write it down, like maybe just on a scrap of paper or something. But you're also welcome to share it in the chat box if you're comfortable with that. And I think at this point, the chat box is just going to be in the panelists. So you're welcome to share whatever you'd like, knowing it's mostly just going to me and Fran would see it too. I'm just going to check the chat box for me. Someone's wanting to calm racial tensions. Uh, Someone's sharing teaching mindfulness to religious groups that may feel its Buddhist roots or against their religion. For example, Christians may feel it has satanic roots. Um, Finding ways to simply communicate mindfulness skills when there is a language or cultural barrier. Um, Someone's hoping to help their clients, which are women with hair loss, to reduce their stress levels and get grounded so they can move forward. Um, Helping with fitness. People after heart attacks can be fearful, and this fear can paralyze them, and believe mindfulness could help with changing their life and preventing a new heart attack, even enhance quality of life. Helping people connect with their sense of purpose in life, learning how to manage anxiety, to engage positively in climate change action. So, folks to help with their nervous systems, stress nervous systems after trauma. Stressful life as a recent immigrant in this country. So here's some examples of things that are coming up. And so in my opinion and my experience, mindfulness can be adapted to support just about any population or health outcome, but it often is served best if we really consider certain elements in doing so. And so I'm gonna flip back to my slides. So like, how can we do this? And so this is a framework that I developed with a number of colleagues like Willem Kuyken and Becca Crane and Judd Brewer and Jeff Prue, Menga Sangvi, and others. And there's also been some advances and some recommendations on that framework since then by Doug Oman and Roman Politsky and team. I put their citations down there too. So I think of us as like a community just advancing skillful uses to develop frameworks that can help people adapt mindfulness programs. So one of the elements is that center blue circle of like the mindfulness program fundamental and active ingredients. And so when we think about like mindfulness, what are the fundamental elements of it, and what are the active ingredients? And it may be different, from person to person or training to training. And I think it can be helpful to just be transparent about it. And so, for example, with my mindfulness training, uh, the first sizable amount of it was through like a Vietnamese Zen tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh that I learned very much and became ordained in that tradition and received a lot of mentoring and feedback and felt like I understood the teachings quite well. There's always more to learn. And then I also became trained as a mindfulness-based stress reduction teacher and went through the certification process to feel quite confident in my ability to teach MBSR. So when I'm developing programs, I'm looking at it through that lens. But we're also seeing a number of different religions and wisdom traditions uh, finding strong mindfulness elements within them. So say within Christianity, there could be like centering prayer, for example. There can be mindfulness practices in like Sufi religions, and there's actually uh, in some ways a rediscovery of mindfulness elements that have been there for centuries in other religions too. And so we're often starting to find what we call like analogs of mindfulness practices. So say that concern of a participant of like, if I'm teaching mindfulness to a Christian community, there can actually be really wonderful mindfulness practices that help us connect. And in many ways, for example, prayer can help us really be centered and grounded and offering kindness towards others that have analogs to, say, loving kindness meditation in a Buddhist framework. So we can often find the mindfulness program fundamental and active elements, but just to be transparent about it so that we know what we're talking about, because it can be a broad term and there can be different traditions that we learn different elements within, and it's okay. It's all wisdom, and as long as we're just clear on what the roots are, and so then that can allow us to replicate it if we want to, or to understand what we're learning. That circle to the right, that's another like fundamental knowledge domain on the team to have is a real deep understanding of like, say, the culture and values and communication patterns of target demographic groups. So for example, I have a colleague who was a lawyer at a very respected firm, and John Kabat-Zinn, the creator of mindfulness-based stress reduction, came to her firm and gave them some mindfulness training, and she's like, wow, this is remarkable. And she ended up going through MBSR training herself and now offers it often to law firms because she really understands the culture, values, and communication patterns of lawyers and did a really effective job bridging mindfulness training with that. When I work with, say, Jeff Prue, who is a Mohawk Native American researcher and mindfulness expert, he really understands the culture, values, and communication patterns of certainly his tribal nation, but as he collaborates with tribal nations around the country, recognizing that each tribal nation is quite unique and has different values as well, he comes to know them and to work shoulder to shoulder to create mindfulness programs that really resonate with those communities. So we could be doing this with the military, we could be doing it with children, we could be doing it in school settings, all kinds of stuff. And then that top circle is around like really understanding the delivery setting. So where are we planning to offer this? Is this going to be like a mindfulness app? Will it be done like in a workplace for, say, businesses? Will it be done, say, through a clinician's office and billed as a group medical visit? Will it be done, you know, in a kindergarten? And so again, we personally, as an individual, don't need to know all of these things, but if we're going to develop something to have people on the team where at least one person, preferably multiple ones, really understand these domains and there's good communication among the team members will really set us up for success. Uh, the bottom circle is around just really understanding like what are existing effective interventions for the target health outcome. And so mindfulness is often considered to be like complementary and integrative to evidence-based medicine. In fact, in many ways, it's becoming evidence-based medicine itself too. But when we look at existing elements like participatory medicine or motivational interviewing or setting action plans or goal setting, there's elements of that that come into a lot of mindfulness programs. And so can we actually be harnessing what already works to foster health and well-being so that we're actually boosting the effects of those or integrating in with them? And if we can understand what those effects are, we may be able to create a more holistic, multifaceted intervention that might have even greater effects. There's pros and cons of that. The more things we put into the intervention, we know what is the active ingredient of what's driving it. But then at the same time, we're often finding interventions that have multiple forms of behavior change often have greater effects. So we're trying to kind of balance those two dynamics. And then the right circle is like understanding like what we call like the etiology of the target health outcomes. So we often know quite a bit about what drives health outcomes. So say in the context of blood pressure, uh, I'll show this next slide here. If we're what this bottom green bar here is say if we want to influence blood pressure, we know a lot about what influences blood pressure. And so that's what that blue box is on the bottom. So major drivers of blood pressure, things like physical activity, obesity, diet, alcohol use, stress reactivity. There's a lot of really good medications out there now that bring blood pressure down. And so if mindfulness is going to influence blood pressure, it's probably going to happen through the major drivers of hypertension. And so if we really understand the etiology of whatever health outcome we have, we're going to be better able to adapt the mindfulness program to engage with those major drivers of the health outcome to again stack the deck in our favor of really impacting the health outcome. And so as we developed this mindfulness-based blood pressure reduction program, we started to really think, well, how could we train people up in the mindfulness skills of, say, self-awareness and attention control and emotion regulation, and then direct those skills towards the determinants of blood pressure. So that we developed a program that really trained people up in mindfulness skills, starting with like grounded in mindfulness-based stress reduction. But then we have particular modules, where we're looking at people's like self-awareness, like their awareness of their thoughts, emotions, physical sensations in relationship to, say, challenging foods, so that we bring challenging foods into the room, like, say, sweet foods or salty foods or even healthy foods, and invite people to really notice their thoughts, emotions, physical sensations before, during, and after eating those foods. And we do the same around actually engaging in physical activity, like aerobic physical activity in class, where again, we notice people to do this meditation of just monitoring their thoughts, emotions, physical sensations before, during, and after physical activity. And when they come back from the physical activity, I've just put everybody raise their hand if they're feeling better. And like 95% of people or so raise their hands if they're feeling better. And isn't that interesting that we tend to feel better after physical activity, often for hours? And we do similar things with alcohol use or how we react to stress, for example, and even our relationship with medications. So we're enhancing that self-awareness for sure, but then we're directing it towards our relationship with the drivers of blood pressure and then see what insights arise. And most of us have insights around, things we could do to eat better and be more physically active. And it's one thing to know it, what we should do, and it's another to actually do it. And that's where the attention control training comes in, where we're training ourselves like through the MBSR curriculum to, choose an anchor point, say of our breath or part of the body or sound, to be there with that anchor point. The mind's going to wander. And when it does, we notice where it wandered to. And that's good self-awareness of how we are today. And we invite it back. like back to this moment, back to this breath, or to this part of the body, or this sound. We get better and better at placing our mind where we choose to place it, so that when we have an insight, we're better able to actually direct our mind to act on that insight, to actually, put on our shoes, say, to go for that walk or to make that healthier choice around the food. And so that's like the theory behind it, of how it could operate, along with improving our emotion regulation, so that mindfulness can become sort of like an early stress detection warning system, where as we become more aware of our thoughts, emotions, physical sensations, we can start to see the stressors arising before they're overwhelming, and to use skills like they train in mindfulness-based stress reduction, like the stop practice that stands for stopping and taking a breath or taking a moment, observing, and then proceeding based on what our wisdom is sharing with us. And so that can maybe allow us to regulate our emotions more skillfully using mindfulness training, rather than to regulate our emotions, say, with grabbing a quart of ice cream out of the freezer, or just streaming something uh, as a sedentary behavior, or just having a drink of alcohol or whatever. And not, with mindfulness, it's like non-judgmental awareness, including not judging ourselves for whatever coping strategies we use to deal with stress, but just noticing them. And so that is the framework that we developed, that we then wanted to test, to see if adapting a mindfulness program to the drivers of blood pressure would bring blood pressure down. And so, with funding actually from the National Center for Complementary Integrative Health from the NIH, we use this approach called the Science of Behavior Change framework, where we first, looked at that graph and picked a mechanism, which was self-awareness. And then we picked a behavior of change, which was diet. And then we looked at the distal outcome, which was blood pressure, and we pre-registered all those primary outcomes on clinicaltrials.gov as those were the three outcomes, so that we're not doing some kind of like fishing expedition to like just see what random thing happened to be affected and then report that. But these are so I'll report on our three primary outcomes. So one was the interoceptive awareness. This is like self-awareness, particularly of the body. We use this validated measure called the multidimensional assessment of interoceptive awareness, and we found nice improvements in self-awareness. So part of when we're adapting mindfulness-based programs is to see what are we trying to like really act on mechanistically. And so we wanted to act on self-awareness and found that there was a signal there. We looked a lot at diet and provided those like eating meditations, for example, and other specific adaptations to diet, and found that adherence to the DASH diet, which stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension, was significantly improved compared to the control group. And that's the most evidence-based diet for bringing blood pressure down. And then we also found nice reductions in systolic blood pressure that also outperformed the control group. So that's sort of like an example of adapting to high blood pressure. When we look at, 9 core principles of like, say, if you are thinking about adapting mindfulness program, these are some principles that the field book for mindfulness innovators really encourages us to consider. So one is just to clarify our intentions, like why do we want to innovate? And so say if I wanted to innovate to create the, Loucks mindfulness intervention for blood pressure control, like if I wanted to innovate to have some kind of fame or make money off it, uh, not good reasons to innovate. But if we want to innovate to say serve others, to improve health or well-being or whatever it is, to foster performance, or um, start to be some better reasons, and to really adopt a beginner's mind to explore the problem that you wish to solve. Because sometimes we can have preconceived notions around what we think is the solution, and it can block us from actually listening to like really key stakeholders who really know this work. So, I interview policymakers and health insurers and clinicians and patients and mindfulness teachers, even Buddhist scholars, when I'm developing programs, to really understand from all angles what might be most likely to be effective. And can we build on the knowledge and learning that already exists? Can we respect people's understandings of their own needs? And mindfulness probably isn't for everyone. And so can we just offer it to those that it resonates with, and but to not push our views on others? Can we invite and embrace diverse and challenging voices? And it's just really important, with the Mindfulness Center at Brown, at least half of our external advisory board members are members of historically underrepresented groups in the mindfulness field. And how can I listen and embrace their voices and grow from it, because there's great wisdom there. And it's actually it's one of the best opportunities for the field to grow, is to listen to the voices that have so much wisdom that haven't been heard as much, because that's where the innovation lies. And can we test and improve rapidly, being prepared to let go of what doesn't work? Can we build our own evidence base so we can be confident in our claims? And can we know our limitations? Can we collaborate with others with the skills that we need and walk the talk? Can we deepen our own personal practice so that we're actually really trying on for size what we're suggesting that we would offer to others, so that we can deeply understand it ourselves? So, just as another example, we adapted, mindfulness program to young adults that have, similar challenges to older adults, but also unique ones too. And we developed this mindfulness-based college program where all the peers are also young adults. We do more peer-to-peer, small group work, have more modules like specifically on, say, digital media use, or uh, different physical health elements as well. So it's been an opportunity where, again, we looked at an overall health summary score that's really relevant to young adults, and found nice improvements. Found improvements in sedentary behavior and sleep quality, depression symptoms, loneliness. Um, and then I scaled it to offer it through the platform of a book. And just like as an example, this young adult, spent his 19th birthday like in jail, and struggled with substance use as a young person. And he talked about, like, when I put a substance of any kind in my body that feels good, it tends to set a chain of events into action that doesn't make me feel good. And even when the first one turns me into someone I don't want to be. There's this saying, there's certain things that control is impossible the moment it's suggested, and that's alcohol and drugs for me. When addiction was manifesting itself in heavy ways for me, I think I was looking for something. I was looking for something the world isn't offering, something that made me feel whole and connected. The practice of mindfulness is the most direct route to that feeling. It takes some hard work, courage, and commitment, but there's no moment at which it's not possible. And so this individual has now started to go into the training to become a mindfulness-based college instructor, and is just like a remarkable model to other young adults, because he's lived through it. And so, as we're starting to think about, adapting to different, say, populations or contexts or cultures or health outcomes, or uh, these kinds of questions can help us reflect on whether we need to adapt or not. And so, for example, why, even asking ourselves, like, why is an adaptation needed? And does a current mindfulness program not meet the population being served? And, I think there's like thousands of mindfulness peer-reviewed papers out there right now, and it may be that an intervention already exists. And if that's the case, then we can collaborate perhaps with those individuals and build it out and support it. Or maybe that intervention doesn't exist. But it's good to have a good solid answer to that question. If we look at that theory of just like how a mindfulness program could be adapted, like, does it make sense to all the stakeholders or to all the users of that information? Like that figure that I showed you of like how mindfulness could influence blood pressure, like, did that make sense to you or not? And so we can like build those things out and really test it, say with patients, say with that condition, or if we're looking at the military, offering it to personnel in the military and be like, does this make sense to you? Or if it's a particular culture, asking them like, how does this sound to you? And actually, let's build it together. And to even ask ourselves, like, what adaptations are needed, and do the benefits of the adaptations outweigh the costs? So for example, it takes a lot of time to create an adaptation, and ideally you'd be testing it, scientifically to see if it works. And And so if you're going to build something and it doesn't have the scientific evidence, then um, how well will that scale with others compared to using something that does maybe have the evidence? And again, it's just there's no right answer here, but they're just questions for reflection for us to find what really seems to make sense. And is there already a good approach for this issue in the population? So say for anxiety, cognitive behavioral therapy works pretty well, and anxiolytic medications can be reasonably effective. So do we really need a mindfulness program for anxiety? And then when I look at, what folks have developed, like say Judd Brewer with his unwinding anxiety program, or even some of the effects we're seeing with mindfulness-based stress reduction, well, some people cognitive behavioral therapy doesn't really resonate with them, and neither does medication, and mindfulness does. And so maybe there may be good approaches, but there may also be interest in other approaches too. But it's just a good question to ask ourselves. And so, for example, with Jeff Prue and some of his colleagues, they had been developing a program often called Native Mind or Indigenous Mind, and this was NIH funded as well. And they basically offered like a stripped down version of MBSR, uh, and then just built it up with members of a number of different tribal nations, particularly the Klamath Nation, like in another one in Northern California and Southern Oregon. But they've also worked with Native Americans in the Southwest and the Southeast and the Northeast. And so that they can really understand uh, the wisdom that can be coming from Native American populations to co-create a mindfulness intervention that really meets their needs and interests and culture. And so uh, I've been a little bit involved with it with a pilot grant that I have with Jeff with the Mohegan Tribal Nation that we're also expanding out, likely with Narragansett Nation as well. And some of the things that have been coming out is, with the different um, mindfulness movements, for example, there's many indigenous mindfulness movements. Sometimes it's dance, like the Eastern blanket dance, for example, but sometimes it's also like, say, beading or weaving of baskets, for example, that can be really contemplative, but also really focus on concentration so that they're bringing in these indigenous mindfulness movements into the class. So where past we might have, say, done yoga or mindful walking, there might be these practices instead. Some of the work with Jeff is focused on diabetes management and also increasingly with blood pressure management as we collaborate. And so pre-colonial foods are really effective at managing diabetes and blood pressure. And so in many ways, because of uh, settlers coming in and displacing Native Americans from their lands and then shifting to subsidized foods and the loss of being able to harvest healthy foods from the lands resulted in uh, higher levels of consumption of processed foods and stuff. And so there's this movement, food sovereignty movement in many ways that are bringing Native American communities back to like the pre-colonial foods that are really healthy. And whether it's, in the Northeast, we might see, say, the strawberries or lean meats, but it can be different foods depending on the region that the indigenous communities are from. Also, there has been like a loss of tribal language over time, and a real interest in preserving it and transmitting it over to next other generations. And so tribal languages are coming into the meditations that are being offered. So say, for example, with the body scan, we connect with each and every part of the body. And so some tribes are bringing their native language in, and even say in some tribal languages, the word for breath is actually wind. So you can see how that can connect us to the natural environment even more when we're talking about the wind coming in and out of us rather than just the breath. Along with bringing in indigenous teaching stories that offer, how to bring, mindfulness can have so much about bringing our wisdom into this present moment. And many indigenous teaching stories have those elements in them. And so can we offer those? So this is an example of like decolonizing mindfulness or just creating something that's already been there, but just really resonates with the communities that are building it out. Uh, if we look at examples, say with Latinx, Latina populations, this was a nice paper that came out a couple of years ago where we can really, if we're building mindfulness programs for Latinx individuals, can we really recognize how heterogeneous Latinx communities are? There's so many different countries and regions that Latinx members can be from, and to really recognize that when we're developing programs out. The social ties and community of Latinx communities can be like remarkably strong. And so can we like harness that power as a strength-based approach? Many Latinx community members have strong religious beliefs, and can we incorporate religious content when it's pertinent? And also to develop training and certification mechanisms to really increase diversity and representation of Latinx mindfulness teachers. We've also seen, with our program, we've developed a mindfulness program, mindfulness teacher training program for people who serve historically underrepresented racial and ethnic groups, and have found particular themes that come through around really seeing what we can do to reduce the cost of the programs and the time commitment. That we're really embodying like trauma sensitivity with the programs, cultural awareness, and also making sure that we have diversity in our teachers by race and culture as well. So there's a number of really excellent pieces of work happening. These are a couple of books out uh, on recommendations, including for African American women, to really have, say, Afrocentric history and connection to yoga. Like Rosa Parks, for example, was a yoga teacher. Like there's many elements. This Black Women's Yoga History book is really excellent to help us understand how mindfulness has already been present in African American communities for generations. And sometimes it has different words and languaging to it, but it's there. And how do we express that out? So just as we're starting to finish up, I think we can be considering like 8 steps to adaptation. So one is, if we're thinking about adapting a mindfulness program, like just determine if the work is needed, and then secondly, really articulate the aim and the intention of the adaptation, and the theoretical basis of why it's even important for this population or context, and start to generate and develop ideas for the necessary adaptations with key stakeholders, like with all the folks who could influence it and be influenced by the program. And then start to evaluate the feasibility. Sometimes we're just starting to do these initial test runs of certain modules with, the population that we're trying to serve, and quickly get their feedback on it. How did that one resonate with you? Do you have any recommendations? And we kind of recursively go through steps 3 and 4 until we get like a theoretically plausible, acceptable, feasible, potentially safe and potent adaptation that we can pilot. And for a lot of the innovators and teachers, they might end at step 5. And then for the researchers, we're often going through steps 6 to 8, where we're actually doing a pilot clinical trial and see how that goes. And then if it goes well and see what the lessons are learned, we go to like a adequately powered, like randomized controlled trial, and then continue to scale it out. But sometimes we have to take steps back to, really develop the intervention. So these are some of the steps to adaptation in this paper. If you want to check it out, it's open access, my name, but it's global advances in health and medicine. So that's like a whole framework that we've offered that has all this content. And also this is being recorded, and you're going to receive the video. So you can always like check out the references another time if you want. Just the last example of an adapted mindfulness program is mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. We also teach this at Brown and offer a teacher training program in it, as well as MBSR. But it's one of the longest standing examples of an adapted program, and it's also, in my opinion, been very nicely done and very nicely researched. And so there were few researchers and clinicians, Zindel Siegel, Mark Williams, and John Teasdale in the UK and Canada, who were experts in my understanding in cognitive behavioral therapy, but they're also feeling like it wasn't doing as much as they thought it could do for preventing relapse of depression. And they've wondered if mindfulness could help, and they started to get trained up in mindfulness-based stress reduction and to really talk a lot with John Kabat-Zinn They created this blended program of MBSR and cognitive behavioral therapy. And so when we look at like, what do they do? Like, what were they aiming to do? And so one of the core themes was that they were trying to figure out how to best prevent the establishment and consolidation of negative thinking patterns so that when we're those of us, when we're suffering from depression, it can have us in negative thought patterns that can then lead to more negative thought patterns, which can lead to more negative thought patterns, and it's hard to bank out of them. And so, they're talking about how it's like we're not trying to keep the negative mind states out of mind altogether, but really just try to prevent their establishment when they occur. And so they were very clear on what they were trying to do. And so they talked about, the core skill to be learned is just it's how to exit and stay out of these self-perpetuating cognitive routines, recognizing that kindness plays an essential role through it. So self-care, self-kindness that pervades all aspects of the class, and that it's really experiential learning. That it's one thing to like read a book about it and to have the intellectual knowledge, but that it might be helpful, but it's by itself completely inadequate. That we can only develop these skills through direct experience. And so this program offers the direct experience to develop those skills. I sometimes think about it as, this sort of negative uh, spiraling thought pattern. And mindfulness can help with, let's say, the self-awareness of like, oh, I'm in a funk. Like here I am in this negative thought pattern. And so we can take that step back. Sometimes we call it decentering and just be like, okay, I'm in this negative thought pattern. Is it helpful or not? And it may be, maybe we just really need to figure this thing out. And it's hard, but we're facing it. And if it is, then we can keep thinking about it. But if it's not helpful, then we can use those skills of attention control to like redirect our thought to a more helpful place. So this is a framework. This is necessarily like, I haven't seen this published with MBCT. This is something that I created for other contexts, but I often feel like MBCT is working in a way consistent with this. And then these are the results. Each one of these boxes is a randomized controlled trial on MBCT, and this group led by Willem Kuyken at Oxford combined all the data, and that diamond at the bottom is the overall effect, and it's basically showing about a 31% reduction in the likelihood of having a relapse of depression if you're not currently depressed when you go through MBCT compared to going through some other program. So 31% lower likelihood of getting depression. When they compared MBCT to any kind of active treatment, it could be cognitive behavioral therapy, it could be progressive muscle relaxation, for example, it still outperformed the active treatments. So about a 21% lowering of risk for having a relapse of depression. And even when they compared MBCT to antidepressant medication, about a 23% drop in the likelihood of relapse to depression. So, that's an example of MBCT. And just, as we look at things as a whole, it seems that adapting mindfulness programs happens, not only by researchers, but also by mindfulness teachers and mindfulness developers who are really hoping to best serve the populations and the contexts that they work within. And my hope is that these frameworks can provide support for us to just skillfully explore why, when, if, and how to adapt mindfulness programs in order to maximize benefit. So thank you. And if you ever want to check out more, these are a couple of websites to the Mindfulness Center at Brown, and then also our professional training programs at the School of Professional Studies. So I'll just stop sharing my slides now, and I think we've got a little bit of time to go through some questions, for example, to discussion.
Thank you, Eric. What wonderful examples and such rich information. So we do have a number of questions coming in, but I encourage those of you who submitted questions in the chat box. I'm wondering if you could actually send them through the question and answer feature. That might make it a little bit easier to address them. But first, Eric, I wonder if one question I've seen come up a couple different times is essentially for those individuals who aren't researchers and are looking to adapt mindfulness. A couple of questions that have come up have been, one is, what would you, if you could spend a few minutes just talking about what the core components are that you see in a mindfulness-based program, what they are, and then two, for those who are not researchers, what are the kind of guiding principles or for adapting, and what are the limitations of not having that evidence necessarily behind it? So I guess that's
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. So there've been attempts to define what a mindfulness-based program is. So there's a paper by Rebecca Crane in 2017 in the Journal of Psychological Medicine. It's called "What Defines Mindfulness-Based Programs: The Warp and the Weft." And so if you're wanting to like see what some senior mindfulness teachers and developers, including John Kabat-Zinn and Mark Williams and others, feel are sort of the fundamental elements of mindfulness-based program. It's in that paper, but examples are, I'm just going to read them, but it's informed by theories and practices that draw from a confluence of contemplative traditions, science, and the major disciplines of medicine, psychology, and education. That it's underpinned by a model of human experience, which addresses the causes of human distress and the pathways to relieving it. It supports the development of greater attentional, emotional, and behavioral self-regulation, as well as positive qualities such as compassion, wisdom, and equanimity. And so those are examples. I think, the papers by Doug Oman and stuff are offering some critiques on that too, that, you know, we're doing our best here to like figure out what the core elements are and I think we need to look at it both from like a wisdom perspective and a respect to the tradition that we're looking at, as well as what the evidence base suggests. So if we look at the evidence base, so say that self-awareness mechanism that I showed you, that's interoceptive awareness, is starting to suggest that it is a mechanism, a fundamental element of mindfulness, like self-awareness of our thoughts, emotions, physical sensations seems to drive and be a mechanism of health outcomes. So that might be something that we really want to bring in. Or mindfulness itself has been shown in systematic reviews and meta-analyses to also be an important mechanism. So that if we're training the participants in mindfulness, paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally, there's different definitions of it. I often think of it as another definition of bring our wisdom into this present moment, like wherever we get our wisdom from. And so to be training participants up in that seems to be fundamental, to be one of the active elements of just how mindfulness programs operate. So those are some examples, but the paper like the Global Advances in Health and Medicine paper that this framework is based on has a number of those in it as well. That's open access, like free access, if you want to check it out. Good.
Thank you, Eric.
Pleasure. Do you want me to go through these and yeah,
If there's
or
any
you,
that stand out to you, I can look.
yeah, or if you have one that you see, feel free to offer it. Just out of respect for time. So there's one question from Siobhan that says, how can mindfulness interventions be used to help make structural changes? For example, not just coping skills to cope with stress, but to stop the stress being created in the first place. And so it's sort of this example, if we're dealing with, institutionalized racism and major social determinants and environmental determinants of health, is just like meditating gonna like make it all go away. And I think there's really important work in this area. I think one of the best examples that I've seen who's embodied it is actually Thich Nhat Hanh, who grew up as a monk during the Vietnam War in Vietnam and was in a monastery deciding whether to stay in the monastery or to actually go out and support communities that were, being bombed, and to help rebuild those communities and build schools. And so there's sort of that engaged element of it. So one is, I think mindfulness can help, this idea of mindfulness being like bringing our wisdom into this present moment. We might have wisdom, doesn't really matter that we have it unless we're bringing it right here, right now. So around concerted structural action on, say, social determinants of health or environmental determinants of health, what is our wisdom sharing with us? And can we then act on it? And also, can mindfulness provide us with the resilience and the self-care so that we don't get burnt out when we're doing really important work that needs to be done? And can it also help us not ruminate? So that, again, we don't get burnt out when we're doing this kind of work, so that we can be directing our energy towards areas that will have the greatest impact. And um, I think there's a book called The Miracle of Mindfulness by Thich Nhat Hanh that's like an example of like actively using mindfulness to engage with major political, social challenges. And my book, The Mindful College Student, also has it, particularly for young adults. We have a whole section on how to adapt it to your political environment, social environment, natural environment, career, etc.
Mhm.
It's a good question. Just
What do
aware
you
of the
think? So
time.
we'll do one more and then the
Yeah.
poll. Yeah.
Okay.
How
Sure.
about, here's a question. Are there groups who have adapted the mindfulness programs for group medical appointments?
Yes. There's wonderful work happening in this area. Uh, Zev Schumann Olivier at Harvard Medical School and the Center for Mindfulness and Compassion there is doing outstanding work in this domain. Also, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, like Isabel Roth there is also doing really important work. There is an organization uh, that is at the forefront of this, like blanking on their name right now. I've been like communicating with them. I don't know if I can pull it up fast enough, but uh, the lead person in many ways is like Paula Gardner, Gardiner, and they offer whole training programs that are actually free of cost. The Wheel Foundation, like Andrew Wheel, is sponsoring people to go through uh, programs on how to offer group medical visits that are reimbursable by health insurance in the complementary integrative medicine field. And Paula Gardner and Zev Schumann Olivier have been doing this for years and are really excellent at it. So there's some really important work going on in that area. And I'm actually like really actively exploring bringing my research into some of those domains too. Good.
So we're almost out of time. I'm wondering if we can, in the interest of possibly bringing a course specific about to teaching folks to adapt mindfulness to a specific population or health condition, we would love to just pose a quick poll to see to gauge your interest in that. So I will put that up now.
Basically, we are considering like a deeper program on this that people really want to go into it. And then also you can bring the programs that you're thinking about and we'll give you support to build them out yourself.
Mhm.
So we're just trying to get a sense of would people even want that? And so if you wouldn't mind answering those two questions, it'll help give us a sense of if you would, if folks would like this kind of thing, and then also what would be the best format for the delivery of it if we offered it, whether it's like online or self-paced or
Mhm.
person. Give you a moment to fill that out if you don't mind.
And we will be posting the recording online. We'll send out an email with the link to that once it becomes available. A few more seconds for folks to fill that out. And then I'm also going to drop in the chat. Here's the link to our to find out more about our online programming that we add. There's also, if you have any specific interests or questions or want to meet with a mindfulness expert, there's a form to fill out to meet with an advisor. So I saw a number of questions come through about how to receive specific training. So feel free to send that in. We'd love to meet with you.
Good. So
Yeah.
I think we should
Any closing-
probably bring it to a close given the time. But any last words, Fran, around?
No, I just want to thank you again for coming and speaking with us, Eric. We always enjoy hearing from you, and thank you everyone who gave up an hour tonight to listen to this talk. All right.
Good. Thanks. And I'm going to read all your comments now too. There's a lot of richness there. So glad we got to connect tonight, and I wish you the best on your next steps, whatever they are. So thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.